A very warm welcome to our Power of Choice webinar with our partners, Blackhawk Network, a business who connects brands and people through branded payment solution. We've worked with them over the years and they're really fabulous, and the insight you're going to get on this is fantastic. So as you know, our focus has continued to be keeping you, our members, inspired and motivated and stimulated by our extensive webinar program, focusing on our well-being, of course, and also, and very importantly, keeping us connected as a global community. And these times has allowed us to do that more than ever before, and we've seen more opportunities coming up very soon as well. So everyone talks about customer engagement. We certainly talk about customer engagement a lot at the Marketing Society, and we know as marketers, anything that we can do to create and maintain loyalty is the golden ticket for our brands, our businesses, and us. And this is ever more important with the complexity that COVID brings. I think that's an understatement. So today, our speaker, Chris Ford, who I will introduce in just a second, will talk about how UK brands are harnessing the power of choice, along with some interesting trends and hot off the press on this one from their latest research white paper, The Generational Game. So as always with our events, we like to be as interactive as possible. So we're going to use the chat function now to check it's working. And if you have any questions, which we can have after Chris has spoken, when I come back on to have a conversation with him, then pop them as ever in the Q&A box, because that really helps, and please keep them as short as possible so I can ask as many as possible. And then after Chris and I have spoken, we've then got, just like we did before, some time for opportunity to connect with each other and get to know each other. And this time we're going to break out everyone into rooms so you can meet each other on a smaller scale. Last time we were all together, so we thought we'd try something different. So bear with us, but we'll give you all the instructions after the webinar. So on to today, Chris. So Chris has worked for many years. Oh, excuse me, I'm just looking at my my stuff. Chris has worked for many years at Blackhawk Down, and he's been really responsible for the growth of the business. He's worked across lots and lots of sectors, from telecoms to retail to utilities. So he's a real force in terms of what he knows about the power of choice. We've been talking to him about this for a few weeks. I'm really excited as to what he's going to show you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the lovely Chris Ford. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Gemma. Great to be here and delighted to have the opportunity to talk for a few moments about the power of choice. Just open up the presentation. So over the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to look at three particular areas that I think the audience and others will find interesting to talk through. So we're going to start off with a new world we never imagined. What are people really into? And discuss a little bit about the generational game research playback. Really important is we'll be asking three poll questions during the process of my presentation, and great support in the background. We'll run the poll questions. I'll be delighted if people could fill that in, and we can debate some of the responses as we go through the presentation. So importantly, to get things started, we're in a world that I don't think anybody would ever have really imagined. If you just track back 14 weeks and think of a date of the 21st of March 2020, it was the Saturday before the country officially went into lockdown. Many of the countries across the globe had already gone through the process. But for us at a local level, the world really did start to change. If you just think about what you were doing, if you can, 14 weeks ago on that 21st of March 2020, most of us would have been visiting friends, eating out, shopping when we wanted, maybe enjoying live sport and probably being in the pub. Who would imagine 14 weeks on how much things would have effectively changed, and probably changed forever. If people have travelled, and I'm sure people have visited Venice in the past, in the summer months, Venice, unfortunately, can be quite a smelly place, but in today's world, that's absolutely changed. Fish have returned to the canal, and there's been spottings of dolphins to the southern part of the city. which has never happened for the past 60 years. This is a picture of India, and it's the Delhi India Gate, which is a war memorial. The slide on the left-hand side is the Delhi Gate on the 17th of October 2019. And on the right-hand side is exactly the same picture on the 8th of April 2020. People will be more familiar with this picture, which is obviously Westminster Bridge. It's taken on the 8th of April at 10:15 in the morning. And that would have been a site that would have been hugely different prior to the 21st of March. So the planet and the natural world, just from a few of those images, has taken huge benefit from the period of time that we've spent over the last 14 weeks in lockdown. So less travel, less traffic, generally less human movement. But let's have a think about how have we as individuals dealt with this period. Hopefully people haven't seen this too often more recently, but when we first went into lockdown, supermarket shelves were empty, you weren't able to get what you needed when you needed it, and bizarrely, toilet paper ran out. I never really understood why that was, but certainly was an experience that we all had. Not to mention the completely different approach to shopping in supermarkets. They needed to queue for an hour. Essential items, whether inside or outside, your process flow around the store was restricted. And if you happen to forget something as you went around the one-way system within the store, doubling back started to be quite seriously frowned upon. And of course, once you'd gone through that process, you ended up at the checkout. And the experience of shopping from hell that you'd just gone through, you were then often presented with a completely different way to pay at the checkout process. That experience end to end drove many people to find different ways to shop, with online for groceries, obviously if you could get a delivery slot, becoming the new norm. In a study recently by Commerce Hub, which looked across 11,000 responses in 11 countries, what they found was the percentage of people shopping for essential items online as a result of the pandemic had risen from 43% to 68%. Perhaps more pertinently for this conversation is that 49% of those respondents over the age of 50 who did not shop online said they're likely to subscribe to a delivery service in the future, a habit for them that certainly has become their new preference. So the adoption of new ways to pay has accelerated beyond belief. Historically, emerging payments had been considered by many as a nice to have. While with the adoption levels continuing and the underperformance of the market forecasts, it was very difficult to prove a return on investment for changing the way people paid. Obviously, the pandemic has changed all of that. The ability to engage and serve an audience, whether at the till point or remotely, has now been driven by a real and pressing need, a need to provide safe, effective, secure and consistent experiences, including the payment process. It's fair to say that the industry that termed emerging payments as their theme can certainly now drop the emerging word. Retailers' emergence have changed forever, and the way in which us as consumers engage with brands, whether online or in the physical site, has probably changed for the better. Importantly, to look at the consideration of the change of people's behaviours and their needs is whether the UK audience is now ready to take on board the process of using technology. Of course, to support that evolution, consumer engagement and payment is important to understand this landscape. And Hootsuite, who produce an annual report on technology usage and consumption, have produced in Q1 of this year and a view of how the UK, in terms of its population, is changing the way in which it uses online services. And in this particular instance, looking particularly at the way in which people access online information. Interesting stats is 107% of the UK population, meaning more people have more than one device. 96% of users access the internet through their mobile device, and over 45 million have been active on social channels. Align this to the new need we all have around paying since the pandemic, and it's clear that the consumers are trying to transact with each and every one of us in an engagement process. The opportunity and landscape that this presents is phenomenal. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we'd like to go to a poll question at this stage if we can. And that poll question is orientated around how long are you spending online every day, including working hours? And be delighted if you could just spend a few moments completing that. Fantastic. So looking at those poll results, 91% of the audience that's listening at the moment have spent above 6 hours using online technology. And it just goes to show the importance and the effect that people are now seeing from being able to access a whole raft of different media, information, payment processes, and so forth. So a fantastic response, and not necessarily something that's that much of a surprise when you consider that many people on the call are business people. So what that then started to make me think was, actually, if we look at the generational consumption, so we start to think a little bit about how different groups of people use the internet. Visual Capitalists, great company that produce around utilization of content. They did a study recently that looked at how people were using online services, particularly around media consumption during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it produced some interesting information that in every generational group, you would expect that online activity has increased significantly. But what's equally interesting is looking at, when you look at a generation, so in this instance, a Gen Z, 16 to 23-year-olds, is considering how much of that they're consuming in different areas. So maybe not surprising that a 16 to 23-year-old during the COVID pandemic, over half of them have increased their usage of online video, particularly in areas like YouTube. If you look at millennials, so thinking more about 24 to 37-year-olds, typically this generational group tends to have both access to technology, but equally an understanding of the way in which to consume different media types. So what you see across this growth is that the millennial generation has consumed in many different areas, but particularly in 3 areas linking to online access. So online video, TV streaming, and broadcast TV are all areas that are important for that generational group. But don't underestimate, obviously, the increase in usage of things like online press and music streaming. When we look at generational X and we consider the 38 to 55-year-old category, usage has increased across the spectrum, but particular increase towards what you would class as TV broadcasting and online TV streaming services. And then finally, the baby boomers, so the group that sits fundamentally in the area of the oldies, 57 to 64, their usage through broadcast TV, remembering this is online usage, has increased dramatically. So what becomes interesting when you're looking across the generational consumption is based purely on online activity during the lockdown. There's no massive surprises, but it's important to recognise that everybody has increased their usage, as you'd expect. The younger demographic preferring online media, the older demographic preferring classic TV broadcasting. As all generations improve their performance and their understanding of technology and the access, more importantly, to a range of experiences, it's interesting to rerun this report as we go into 2021 to see what effect being in lockdown and changing our behaviours based on a set of new needs will happen to that structure of our society. So it brings me on to this subject of what people really into. So trying to understand what people value, not just in terms of their day-to-day lives, but what their passions are, is what drove us in the first place to consider the generational game research. So looking at our changed world, our needs and behaviours, I think it's fair to say the previous concepts about engagement linked either to generational groupings or demographical structures are something that is really up for challenge. Robert Glazier, who is the founder and CEO of Acceleration Partners, wrote an article last month in the Forbes magazine, so a highly respected financial and research institute. And he basically established a set of challenges around generational and demographic groupings. He, I, and others are now not alone in thinking that you simply can't guess what a person is into based purely on their age, their gender, their location, their earnings, and even their historic behaviour with you as a brand. So I'd like to do the second quick poll, if I may. Specifically, what I'm interested in is the people on the call. How effectively do you think your business knows its customers? So how well do you think your business knows its customers? Again, I'd be delighted if you wouldn't mind completing that for us. And the results are interesting again. So let's have a quick look. So 25% of the base don't know them at all or only slightly well, and 37% consider that they know them somewhat well. About 39% quite well and very well. But the interesting thing is the detail around what people are doing about understanding their customers. And personally, I've spent many, many years working with some of the world's largest brands to try to really uncover what their customers are into. And it's a very interesting debate. Right now, without any doubt, it's certain that age is now just a number. We are generally healthier than we've been at any time in the past. We can experience a raft of things historically we wouldn't have even dared to attempt. Personally, during lockdown, I haven't been commuting for 2.5 hours every day. So that's given me an opportunity to try a few new things. And for me, that's meant Pilates, which if someone had asked me 14 weeks ago, would you have done that? It would definitely be a no. But actually, 12 weeks on, I can even bend and touch my toes, which is remarkable. The other part of this is our generational game report, which I'll talk a bit about in a second, highlights that so many people you wouldn't have expected based on their classical generational groupings actually likes things that you would associate with completely different groups. So in this instance, virtual reality, young people are getting back into knitting, amazingly. And of course, you'll always have what we class as a little bit of the outliers, the people that really, throughout their life, regardless of their age, have pushed the boundaries. We can honestly say right now that age is really just a number. So it brings me neatly on to this concept of the power of choice. And what do we really mean when we talk about choice? So one thing is for certain, today you can't second guess what someone is into. Age, gender, location, race, the standard generational and demographic constructs can't enable any of us to really know what someone is into. As I've mentioned, I've sat in a vast array of very high profile meetings with large brands over the years, and we have literally had access to every data point you can imagine, whether it's online web activity, whether it's payment activity, whether it's engagement with email content, a myriad of different ways of looking at an individual. And it is virtually impossible to second guess based on that data, really what somebody is into, really what drives them and what is their passion, what gives them purpose in life. Hopefully, it's becoming clear that you just can't assume anymore. It's why as a company, Blackhawk has devoted themselves to creating products and services and a range of solutions that are underpinned by this concept of choice. If we look now just at a few examples in the marketplace where brands today have stepped up and changed the way they engage their customers, I think you'll agree some of these are significant for the memory of what the brand has done during the pandemic, let alone the fact that it drives a range of choice options for the recipient. So in the car insurance market, where we have been active for a number of years, none of us can drive our car as much. That means there's not as many claims. And I would argue we're not getting the value for money from a policy we may well have taken out 10 to 11 months ago. So some car companies, Zurich and FBD in Ireland, took the opportunity to engage their customers with a rebate offer, which was based on our One for All gift card. In the instance of Zurich and FBD, both of them used a branded card, so it arrived at the customer's site looking and feeling exactly like their gift card. Obviously, it provides maximum choice as a product, but it offered a range of customers the opportunity to think about that brand when it arrived. So the fact that they got on the front foot before the FCA made a decision to ask the insurance companies to provide holidays for car insurance in terms of the payment, these brands took advantage to say, I can create a choice-backed, relevant and timely proposition to my customers that one will be memorable and more importantly, will drive those customers to become loyal and think about being retained. Part of what the pandemic had done has created a raft of challenge around feeding the UK population, particularly the vulnerable families that exist in our society. The Tesco's and Morrisons thought clearly about how could they execute e-code or e-gift for those vulnerable customers to take advantage of, allowing them to select from their preferred supermarket the relevant lunch voucher that they could take advantage of, thereby keeping the family fed during really tough times. It answers a very specific need, in this instance, the vulnerable customer space, but obviously the recipients could quickly and efficiently choose where they could redeem the value. They weren't tied necessarily to Tesco's and Morrisons, because obviously the likes of Sainsbury's also provided the same e-code value. But the importance is that the brand stepped up and they realized there was a challenge and they instantly reacted to it. And this approach will stand these brands in really good stead as we get back to a new normality. Additionally, Waitrose is a really fascinating company in terms of how they not only provide their services, but engage with their audience. They took the decision to set aside a proportion of hard to find and essential products exclusively for NHS staff. If a staff member arrived at the store and on production of their staff card or their frontline workers gift card, they were allowed to effectively have priority access through to the shop and at the checkout to ensure they were able to get through as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. Very simple, very manageable, and resonates well with key frontline staff. Interestingly for the brand, it wouldn't be a demographic or group of people that would classically shop at Waitrose. What will be interesting is whether this initiative will encourage those audiences to favour that brand in the future. And finally, NatWest. So NatWest recognised that their audiences, in some instances, vulnerable and high-risk audiences, needed a mechanism to provide their carer with the ability to do their shopping. Now, where initially many people were handing over their bank card with their security details to their trusted care worker, NatWest stepped up and decided actually we should create a companion card, a card that effectively allows the carer to pay for essential goods on behalf of vulnerable and isolated customers. The new card acts as a supplement to the existing current account and can be recharged by up to £100 every 5 days. So an interesting approach by 4 brands that have taken the concept of the pandemic and turned that into something that they find or they realised was valuable to them, not just right now, but on a continual basis in terms of brand awareness. So now I just want to talk briefly about our research playback, the generation game, which I'd be delighted if people on the call would like to get a copy of. Please get in touch. Please access the appropriate links on our web estate. Before we do that, let's do our final poll, which is looking at you as generational groups. Oh. Fantastic. So the results suggest that 60% of this audience are between 25 and 39, 30% are between 40 and 45. And then we have the Generation Z at 8% and baby boomers at 2%. So in the millennial space, if you go back to the uses, the consumption, the usage, the online activities, we obviously see a great proportion of people listening that are in that mindset right now. So our research and playback in the generational game really started off at the end of last year, and we executed it in February and early March of this year. It was prior to the pandemic, but the results are only emphasised by the pandemic situation that we sit in. So one of the little snapshots is across those generational groups that we've just explored as the audience, we looked at a set of hobbies. These are the top 15 hobbies and how people in those generational groups take advantage of them. We found that there was mention of 120 plus hobbies across the whole response level that we got, which was a significant amount of interest and passions that we certainly weren't expecting. I've pulled out just a couple of those highlights that I think you'll find interesting. So remembering this was before the 21st of March, when we all went into lockdown, the first highlight was that 1/3 of Brits spend just 2 hours a week on their hobbies and pastimes. Obviously, as I've mentioned, whilst we've been in lockdown or are in lockdown, a significant volume of people would have significantly increased their hobbies and interests and passions, and probably found new passions as well. A second highlight, don't assume that board games are only enjoyed by older generations. We can stereotypically put people into categories when in fact, a range of under 40s found board games to be extremely interesting and compelling for them. And at the end of the day, Monopoly, Cluedo, Scrabble, classic board games will never really change. They're always things that people take advantage of. Third highlight was that a lot of millennials, so people on this call, for example, 60% of you suggest that 23% highlighted that cleaning was a stated hobby or interest, which surprised me. And then finally, our fourth specific generational highlight was that the Generation Z, who had classically often talked about travel and holidays being significant hobbies, passions and pastimes for them, actually we found that that wasn't necessarily the case now, and it didn't figure in their top 15 hobby lists. And finally, I just want to touch on an additional piece of that generational game analysis that we did, which was thinking about how do we as businesses engage with our employees and our customers from the point of understanding them well enough that we know what they're into. So of those surveyed who worked at places where recognition and reward initiatives were offered, 62% actually used that benefit on their hobby or pastime. We know through our own work in employee engagement that for many years that if your employees feel engaged and rewarded, they are typically happier. Happy employees will deliver better customer experience, creating happy customers, which leads to improved business performance, not to mention an increased advocacy from the customer base. So classic generational groupings aren't definitive of what people identify with when it comes to passions. We've found over the years of providing choice-based product services and solutions that choice actually negates the need to second guess people's real wants and desires. You can't offer people everything, but you can empower them to make the best choice for themselves. Thank you. I'll just invite Gemma now to come back. I think we might have a few questions.
Hello there. Brilliant. So thank you so much, Chris. That was fantastic. Lots of insight, and actually you've had quite a bit of chat where people are asking like different things, but we'll get that into the Q&A. So get your questions ready, and please use them, as I said, in the Q&A function, not the chat ideally. And before that, I have a couple of questions for you. You talk a lot about choice. Why do you think it's so important today?
I think it has two levers to it, really. The first lever is we all spend a huge amount of time as marketeers trying to decide what's most relevant for a consumer or an employee, but particularly in this case for a consumer. And we can get that horribly wrong. When we get it horribly wrong, the cost to the business for getting it wrong is significant. Not only the effort associated with the campaign, the product, the proposition, but it can also have a brand impact above the line. So what we found by providing a choice-backed proposition is that people choose for themselves what they want and how they want to use it. Providing someone with something that offers them choice across every retail outlet, every online environment you could imagine, they choose how they want to use the value that you're prepared to give them. It's not your choice. And what you find is that people will go off in lots of different directions using the content you've delivered. Some people aren't interested in film streaming. Some people aren't interested in downloading music. Some people aren't interested in online newspapers. So if you get those things wrong, you turn a lot of your audience off. Whereas if you provide them with a lot of choice and they choose how they use it, actually you get a great return.
Lovely. So how do you think AI is affecting the way choice and consumer personas are developed? And that's come from Brittany in our audience.
So artificial intelligence, if you take that in terms of a data source, so I'd like to look at that as augmented intelligence rather than artificial. Artificial feels as if it's a bit scientific. If you look at augmented intelligence, so it's another data source that provides a really granular representation of an individual, whether that is at a locational level or whether that is at a physical level. The artificial intelligence aspect adds to the data pot. but it will help to uncover some interests, but not every interest. So again, it comes back to, it's another data source that potentially adds to the pot, but doesn't necessarily still tell you what someone's passions are.
Yeah, lovely. And I quite like this question. It's an anonymous attendee, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it, but given a lot of our audience are millennials, which I thought was interesting, what's the best choice gift for engaging a millennial audience?
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you go back to that research and you think about what you would classically have thought millennials were into, it's really surprising that many people are into things that you would naturally associate with somebody else. So if you were looking at a choice gift for a millennial, you'd be using something that gives broad redemption appeal. So One for All, great. Our Select product, great. But the broader the appeal for that person to take advantage of it, the more relevant it will be to that individual.
Like that answer, almost could be in politics there. So I like this one as well, and then I'm going to come back to my questions. Do you think too much choice sometimes leads to no choice? That's from Nick, one of our regular attendees.
Yeah,
in that you get blinded by options, and it's
that's a great.
decisions too difficult.
That is a great question. So historically, we would have run a reward or recognition catalogue that would have been full of 45,000 plus different choices. So it's like the biggest reward and recognition, loyalty platform choice metrics that you could imagine. Everything from Amazon to ZZ and every product type you could imagine. So when you present somebody with that amount of choice in a catalogue, it's virtually impossible for people to make the right choice, because they spend time searching and finding. If you produce something that gives them a set of choices where they are making the decision what they do. So if you look at our Select approach, it typically has a range of retailers that are available underneath the code, and it allows that person to say, actually, I'm going to choose this particular retailer as my preference because I'm particularly interested in garden equipment, or I'm interested in fitness equipment, or I'm interested in cameras or technology or phones. It allows them to make the choice. So it effectively offers maximum choice, but without confusing, which is great.
Lovely. We've got lots of questions coming in, which is fantastic. People are using the chat box. If you can try and move to the Q&A, that would just really, really help. But I'm going to ask this from Kelly. Hi, Kelly. Lovely to see you on our webinar. What's your point of view on balancing choice of the portfolios versus supplying demand on the core?
So choice on the portfolio of just thinking what that's specifically aiming at, Gemma. So just give me
I'm wondering if she needs to, Kelly, if you can just clarify your question a wee bit more. What's your point of view on balancing choice of the portfolios versus supplying demand on the core? It's quite,
probably is it that might be a little bit linked back to the previous answer, which is when you provide someone with 45,000 things to choose from a massive catalogue, it's overkill. It just is impossible to get there. Provide people with a really clear choice of a brand that you recognise for delivering you the product or service that you want. People pick the brand and then choose to shop at that store.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And if Kelly, you want any more clarification on that, then come back to us. Oh, she said thanks.
Oh, there you
it's
go.
Lovely to see you here, because it's been a while since she's been in our event. So it's lovely to see you, Kel. So from Jill, also lovely to see you, Jill. Loving seeing all these familiar faces and names. It's still a very fast moving environment, and there's a theory that it takes at least 6 weeks to see longer term behavioural change. So how can brands try to manage long term changes versus short term changes?
Great question. So it takes 66 days scientifically to create a habit. So when you're looking at people doing the same thing over and over again, 66 days doing it creates the habit. We have been in lockdown longer than 66 days. So people have become aware of a new set of needs, but also aware of the way they've behaved and their preferences. So right now, we have to really take seriously how people have changed the way in which they engage with brands, and particularly the way in which they look now for their choices and their passions across what they buy. So when you're looking at the long term, what's really interesting is the impact that the brands that have reacted positively during the pandemic will have for the long-term value of their customers.
Yeah.
It's always associated to people's passion areas, and if you're relevant, and I find your purpose of your business is linked to what I believe in, I'm going to create long-term advocacy for you.
Yeah, and that makes real sense. Absolutely. So, since we're talking about advocacy, even, what's the one thing that you think we should never stop doing with regards to customer loyalty, building that loyal base?
I think there's probably two clear answers to that. Number one, don't stop thinking about your people, your own employees. They are the lifeblood of your business. And if you get them to be content, happy, and fully engaged culturally, they are naturally going to deliver great customer experience. So that's the first part of it. Never forget the employees. The second part of it is at the consumer level, the customer level, we have to think logically about, we can't guess these people anymore. You couldn't guess what I'm actually interested in based on what I look like or my age. Baby boomer, by the way, but you couldn't guess that.
Never guess, no.
Never. And the important thing is you don't know what I'm into. You can use artificial intelligence, you can use engagement data, you can use activity information that is data driven to have a pretty good guess, but you will really never know. So that whole piece about continuing to provide choice-based propositions in whatever form that comes is critical to long-term value and success.
Lovely. I guess that this question goes on from this, from Jason. Do you think customers prefer a quick and instant reward of a lesser value, or do people prefer to walk towards a reward of greater value? I guess it depends.
Yeah, great question. All of our research, and please visit Blackhawk Network Europe Insight, because there's a lot of great research on there. All of our research suggests little and often is the winner. So small values, really applicable, but delivered in the moment where it's most impactful, they create ongoing relationships with brands. So a little touch now and again, a coffee, something small and not that expensive, all the way through to something that's much more impactful. So, when things go wrong, and we all have things that go wrong in terms of our service delivery and the quality of our service, but when that goes wrong, turn that into an impactful gesture that people will remember. You might have a more value in terms of that gesture, but turn that into something that people receive and really appreciate. Turns negatives into positives, makes a massive difference. So generally small but often, but remember the big areas where good value engagement is really important.
Love that. And we are already running out of time. We've literally got about a minute left for this part of it before we go into the networking piece afterwards, which I will give everyone instructions for. And again, at that point, you can ask Chris and his team more questions, because they are coming in thick and fast, which is absolutely brilliant. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of questions, Chris. What's the key learning that you will take personally from these times that we're living in currently?
I can touch my toes. Didn't realise I could do that, but I can now. Fantastic. But the key learning from a business point of view is be in the moment. Be really aware of what's going on out there. So things change in our world, particularly over the last 14 weeks, but will continue to be the case going forwards. I would absolutely enthuse everybody to make sure they're aware of the things that are happening, not just in your industry, but generically happening, how people are feeling, what their changing circumstances are, because it's those really aware businesses that will maintain great customer connections. And we all take responsibility for being very aware of what's happening in the outside world.
Lovely. So if you could leave our audience with one piece of advice, a key takeaway, because there's lots of things, and we're having lots of people ask, if you haven't answered all the questions in this time, can they contact you afterwards? I'm assuming that is a yes with you and the rest of the team.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Not
Perfect. And
always
also,
got all the answers, but more than happy to try.
yeah, and also we've got the piece later in just a few minutes where you will be able to meet each other as well. And I think, Chris, you're going to stay around for that as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I am.
So your final thing then, a very pithy sentence, because we are over time now. What would be your biggest takeaway for the audience?
Don't try and second guess anymore. You waste your money, time, and effort.
Love it, love it. And that was the style of a tweet. No one ever adheres to that, Bruce. So thank you very much, Chris.